Today in this episode, we are going to be reviewing Rebel Without a Cause, and Damian is going to have his first experience with James Dean.
Who knows? There might not even be a point to this movie, that's what it's alluding to, but I guess we'll find out if there's a cause worth watching this review.
Hello, and welcome to the Damian and Devlin show. And this is our review of Rebel Without a Cause.
You're tearing me apart!
A 1955 movie directed by Nicholas Ray and starring James Dean, Natalie Wood, Sal Mineo, and Jim Backus. Now, when we first started doing reviews, Damian at first said, I don't want to see anything past the 70s, like before the 70s. But later on, he told me, challenge me. So today we really challenged him by going a little further back than he likes. I am a huge fan of James Dean. I used to have posters of him all over the place. I still love him. For those of you younger people who don't know who James Dean is, he basically only made 3 films before his untimely death when he was 24 years old. But he's still considered one of the most iconic Hollywood stars ever, just for 3 movies. And and I was kind of excited to show Damian and nervous because I love sharing stuff I love, but with Damian, you just never know. And not that it's going to kill any of my love for James Dean, but still you kind of hope that he has a positive experience. Now, when we watch the films, we try not to talk too much about it, maybe a little, but sometimes I just don't know exactly what he's going to say, so I'm going to give him his first your reaction of Rebel Without a Cause.
You know, for a long time during this movie, I was thinking, what is the reason behind this movie? I thought it was a movie without a cause. But then I started to kind of understand it's all just about teenagers coming to terms with being teenagers, and we have all been there. And if you haven't been there yet, you'll get there. There are a lot of emotions and hormones. You put it perfectly. It's a coming-of-age movie, and right dab in the center of the 1950s. So World War II had only been over for 10 years. Korea was about to start. Very, very innocent movie. And you know what? I didn't hate it as much as I thought. You kept talking up, there's a lot of overacting and blah, 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 things like that. It's classic Hollywood. And I went into it thinking expectations like, oh boy, this is going to be another Wizard of Oz. But it wasn't. It wasn't that bad.
I basically, if you don't know what Rebel Without a Cause is, it's basically a story of 3 young characters who are in different phases in their lives, but they all have one thing in common. They're dealing with growing up. They have lots of issues, a lot of generation gaps with their parents. They all have different relationships with their parents and relationships with their friends. This movie is pretty daring. I was telling Damian that this is considered a groundbreaking movie because before this, teenagers in movies were looked at as either straight-laced or bad, juvenile delinquents. This was the first movie to try to paint teenagers to say that they've got a lot going on and they have a lot to say. Now remember, this is 1955 times, so they can't really go into too much depth, but I think they do a pretty strong job of that. This also takes a look at parenting styles and basically just a look at, how life works and how emotions work and how when you're a teenager, every emotion you're feeling with on top of the hormones is blown up to be almost like the whole world is on your shoulder. That's why I thought the stuff with the planetarium is perfect. Because remember, I don't know, when you were a teen, did it seem like every problem was the end of the world?
Oh yeah, absolutely.
And the fact that there's so many scenes that deal with the planetarium, I just got that it's so appropriate when they're looking out to the universe, because when you're a teen, you're taking on everything all at once.
Yeah, it's all about you. It's all very self-centered, and even the most minuscule, non-important event is the end of the world. Absolutely, I remember that. And I grew up in 2005, like that's when I first hit high school, so I was right in the transition to the whole emo phase. So everything for me as an emo kid was, oh my god, the whole world is ending. This is the most disastrous thing to happen to anybody ever. So I could totally relate with the characters on with regards to that. So
why don't you start in your positives?
yeah, and I'm going to touch on that. My mom, just like you, was a huge James Dean fan. I remember the James Dean posters being up in our house when I was growing up and thinking, who is that? She tried her best to explain it to me, but being a kid, didn't really care unless it was a cartoon at the time. Now as an adult I can go back and yes, I've heard it time and time again. Oh, James Dean taken way too soon. He was before his time and things of that nature. This is the very first James Dean movie I've ever watched, and you know what? I think he's a pretty great actor. I was expecting, like I mentioned, over-the-top ridiculousness. I got told many times when we reviewed The Room that this movie, James Dean's acting, inspired Tommy Wiseau so many ways. And I was thinking, oh boy, here we go. And
nobody should take credit for that.
Yeah. Delightfully, however, I was completely shocked in another way. Shocked in the fact that he actually is a pretty good actor. I enjoyed what I saw. His supporting cast did a great job as well. And despite a few moments of what's going on here, like there's not really much happening, it's pretty well thought out once you get through the whole movie. Because once you're right at the end, you're like, okay, I get it now. This is just teenagers living their lives and going through the coming of age thing. But that's, so I mean, besides the good acting, besides the okay plot, there were a little few moments of boredom there that I had. And like I mentioned, this movie kind of seemed to me at points like, what's the point of this? What am I watching? It's very slow at times, in my opinion. But I guess when you think about it, back in the day, 1955, this might have been a very fast-paced movie. I can't tell you because I was not around back then, but for somebody...
Neither was I, just in case you're wondering.
That's what he likes to say. But it's just slow at times, and I couldn't get over those slow-paced moments. The characters are fine. So acting's great. Characters are fine. Plato, I found, was... They didn't really know much about mental health back then, but this kid has a lot of serious mental issues. He just wants to connect. He wants those father and mother figures that he's been devoid of, and it leads to a lot of problems in the movie itself. The characters were okay. There were a lot of throwaway characters, I felt. Your typical Grease cast showed up in their muscle cars, which are beautiful, by the way. I loved the cars. I loved the get-ups that they all had. But just forgettable characters. I mean, Dennis Hopper is in this movie, and like, unless you knew who he was, you just think, oh, there he goes, right? So they're just things that happen, and I guess they should have impacted me more, but because I never got to know the characters, it was just kind of like, oh, that's unfortunate. But overall, it was okay.
I'll hit on some of that in my negatives, especially the Play-Doh stuff. What I do want to hit is two positives that I don't think this movie gets talked about enough. I think for 1955, this is actually a pretty well-written movie. Now, don't get me wrong, it's not perfect. But the fact that they did try to make the three main characters three-dimensional. Now, you got to remember, this was at a time when storytelling was a little different. So they had lots of limitations. And even like nowadays when you see like coming-of-age movies, they don't worry about sex, they don't worry about violence, drugs, anything. But a lot of that had to be hinted on. Like even like just, them, hey, you want to go explore other rooms? Like it almost seems not subtle at all, but back in the 1950s it was probably like, oh, I know what they mean.
Yeah.
But now it's just so blatant. Like I actually like watching old movies for that, to watch subtleties. Like, I think they're talking about sex. Nudge, nudge, wink, wink. Just like I kept telling, I mentioned there may be a gay subplot in this, but you're never going to hear those words. And nowadays, if they remade this, Play-Doh is definitely gay. But they had to do it in such like ways that they couldn't really touch on. And I will get into one of my major negatives of this movie a bit. But I also want to give Nicholas Ray, the director, some credibility. I am a movie buff, but I don't know if Nicholas Ray went on to things. But I've always thought Rebel Without a Cause is my least favorite of the James Dean movies. I love Giant for its storytelling. I love East of Eden. It's my favorite of his. But I never give enough love to Rebel Without a Cause. But the director makes some really interesting choices that I consider really groundbreaking. And I didn't know if I really respected that. And I just wanted to give him a shout out. There's a scene where, like, they're confronting him, his parents, after he's had a really bad night. And there's actually a scene where James steps up onto the stairs. And as soon as his mother steps on the stairs, the camera tilts. Almost like it's like a Batman villain thing. And he does this a couple of times. James Dean is upside down looking on a couch, and they show, and I don't know if that translated in the 50s, but I really liked some of the choices he made. Not to mention, the filming of the chicken scene could have been really badly done for 1955, like stock footage, the whole works. It's not actually bad. I think you made a comment that you thought they did a great job.
I did, and for the scene, the chicken scene, I didn't know how it was going to end. At one point, the two characters, even James Dean is like, "Do we really have to do this?" And I was just like, "Yeah, do you have to do this?" Like,
actually, it was the so-called villain that said,
okay.
"I like you."
Yeah.
Yeah, actually, you're right. James Dean did say it after.
So do we have to do this?
But did you thought it was kind of neat that even though Buzz is a throwaway character, no pun intended, not a spoiler, much. But did you notice that, like, they even tried to give Buzz, like I have to do this for my reputation. I'm actually, like, when you first meet him, he's just like bad, bad, bad. And then at the last minute, they try to make this character like, I'm actually not a bad guy.
Yeah, no,
even James Dean,
done.
Yeah.
And there's a shot where cars go over a cliff at some point in the movie, and like you said, they could have used stock footage. They could have tried to use some kind of special effects or jump cuts, but no, the way that they filmed it was actually really well done. Complete with not even an over-the-top explosion either. It looked kind of realistic. Mm-hmm. I don't know if the car itself would have exploded, but still, it looked semi-realistic for the time. And I have to give my hat, which I am not wearing, off to the director and the cinematography in that instance.
Do you have any other negatives? You mentioned you found it slow, and
there were, like I said, there are a lot of slow moments, and I guess they're for character development, and I appreciate that, but just the way that it approached it was very old Hollywood, and that's why I said when I first started doing this with you, I don't want to go past the 70s, because very, very many times I've been just turned off because old Hollywood, the way they film things, just doesn't translate well with the movies and the way that movies are filmed. How I was raised in the 90s leading into the 2000s. It's night and day. So for me, a little slow-paced, but I understand why they decided to do it. A couple other things that I noticed, plot holes. Apparently, James Dean's car can not outmatch what's his face, his little moped.
Yeah, the scooter.
Yeah, the scooter just
Salminios, yeah.
Yeah,
Play-Doh.
He just seems to appear right there, even though it showed James Dean and his girlfriend leaving like 30 minutes earlier, and then 30 minutes later Play-Doh shows up on his scooter, arriving practically at the same moment, and that's a little weird. It then also shows Play-Doh running away towards the observatory, whereas early in the movie we saw the observatory way off in the distance, way off in the distance. For me personally, if I were to run that distance, it would take me at least 2.5 hours. He does it in 15 minutes, and this kid's a superhero. He's got to be, because that's just a huge plot hole. Those two things there.
You're not going to miss the other superhero plot?
What superhero plot?
That James Dean had minor little stabs on his body at one point, then puts a crisp white shirt on, and without no Band-Aids, stitches, nothing, not one drop of blood.
He's perfect. He's perfect.
He healed.
Yeah.
He healed.
Oh, yeah.
So we got to mention the second superhero.
Also, shout out to another chicken scene. There are 2 chicken scenes in the movie, and I said to you, no way in heck would this get through today, because they used a real chicken dangling on a wire at one point, and it shocked me, because at first I thought it wasn't alive, but then you hear it clucking and it moves, and I'm just like, oh my god.
I'm sure the chicken got lots of work in Hollywood after that.
Just like the horse that they painted several times in Wizard of Oz. That's the same horse,
let's
right?
not go there.
Wink, wink.
But I did have some problems with Rebel Without a Cause, and they're pretty big ones in my opinion. Number one, 2 I have. Number one, this movie does such a good job of trying to make teenagers three-dimensional and show that they have emotions and they mean something too. This movie never looks down at the kids and says, shut up, we don't want to hear your thing. This wants you to hear what kids are going through. And what I love about it is with the kids, Sometimes they don't know what they're going through, and they're not afraid to show that either. They try to say the words, but they can't think it. I think they did good. The problem is that the parents were kind of written cartoonish. They come off really broad-stroked in some ways, which to me kind of defeats what you're doing. Now you'd probably get a movie that has three-dimensional trying everything. But when the parents are kind of walking around like, it to me it just kind of lost something, because the parents kind of act like, well, you guys are selfish, we gave you everything. And you got to remember, the 1950s in America was a plus time. People had lots of income, so they had cars, they were giving everything to the kids, and the kids still weren't happy. But when the parents do this, it just kind of loses something, because the parents aren't really fleshed out. But minor. This one I do have a big problem, and this may have slight spoilers. The problem with Plato is not just he has mental issues, and I think there's a couple people that probably need mental issues. They do try to deal with Plato being a mental issue, but there's also a bigger problem here. He's blatantly a gay character, or at least someone who is trying to find his identity, whether he's bi, whatever. And back in the 50s, they didn't touch at this, so I do give them kudos for trying to tempt it. But they also fell into similar Hollywood tropes. Number one, Plato has to have intense mental issues because he is different. And this is a problem I have with watching old school Hollywood. There's a great documentary called Celluloid Closet that touches on how back in the 50s and 60s, if you came out as gay or any kind of thing, you either paid for it in big ways, you were always messed up for some reason, and Plato gets big things. Like, in the beginning, he's at a police station for killing puppies. How much more can you say this character is bad? And unfortunately, Damian, I think at one point said, I think Plato doesn't have a good chance in this movie, without giving any spoilers. Yeah. And I wanted to tell him at that point, pretty much in the 50s, if you came out, you're not going to have a happy ending. So that's one problem I had. And you know what? I still give them kudos for at least attempting a big story like that.
Yeah. And you know what? Despite the negatives that we do have, there's a lot of good stuff in it too. It's iconic. It's an iconic movie. James Dean, obviously somebody that is very influential for his short time in Hollywood. So definitely get out there and check it out for yourself too, because you might like it. You might discover a romance with James Dean you never knew you had, kind of like me. He was very, very charming in this movie, and I now want to see his other movies.
And I think you want to see more of Natalie Wood as well.
What are you giving this movie?
I give this movie, I'm going to give it a 4 out of 5. I think I gave it a lot more credit this time, but it's still not my favorite of the James Dean movies, but I still love it. And it was also the color. I love old school Hollywood color. Like, it almost seems painted. Like, they painted everything, so yeah, I'm going to give it 4 out of 5. And the color is one of the reasons. I liked how it looks. This movie looks good.
I did appreciate that this movie was in color. Not to say there's anything wrong with black and white movies, because there aren't. I've seen several of them. But it is kind of a joy, especially when you get to see an older movie in color. It adds more depth to it, in my opinion. It adds more likability, realism, relatability. So with all of this in mind, it wasn't my cup of tea. Would I ever watch it again? I don't know. I can't say that for certain, but I'll go right down the middle with it. 2.5 out of 5. It was passable.
Would you go watch other James Dean movies?
Yeah. No, like I said, he's very charming in it. I felt he was a better actor than Elvis Presley. I didn't say that, by the way. But
Elvis could sing.
Elvis could sing, yes. But yeah, no, I do want to see his other movies to see how good he can be.
Anyhow, before Damian wraps this up, if you're new to James Dean, definitely give this one a shot, especially if you're a teenager. I consider Rebel Without a Cause one of the better teenage movies, but you got to go into it remembering the era it was about. But right up there with movies like Breakfast Club and stuff that are great movies that teenagers should watch. I just think it's an important film.
Definitely, I agree with that. Have you seen Rebel Without a Cause? Are you a fan of James Dean? Let us know down in the comments. Make sure to share this with your friends so that they can join in on the action as well. Like, comment, subscribe so you never miss any of our top hits. Thank you so much for joining us, and we will see you next time.
Damian, this is great. Now that I got you to watch a 1955 film, that means we can watch Casablanca, The Adventures of Robin Hood, The Errol Flynn, King Kong, the early one, Black